All right, perfect. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for having us. Really excited to present this work. It's together with Albert Rowe, who's our PhD student, and my colleague Nanja at USC. And what we're going to think about in this paper is how does a government policy to foster AI actually impact the development of innovation? And we're going to look back to 2006 and look at an event where that kind of happened and see what we can learn from that. A fundamental idea that many people might have been exposed to, others depending on discipline haven't, is that government is often trying a variety of things to foster innovation. These tend to be quite idiosyncratic, so there's different ways that this can be done. R&D incentives, property rights, or the extent to which you're going to enforce things like patent, copyright, trademarks, to which extent you're going to allow scientists and researchers to move between companies. Does that help them? Does that hurt them? To what extent you provide work permits and opportunities for people to come emigrate to a country and access a labor market? To what extent does this spur innovation? And then broad kind of innovation initiatives where there's a concerted effort to create expertise or technology in a particular domain. The thing to take away from all this is many of these things help to some extent, but it's often context specific. So if you think about R&D incentives, sometimes they increase innovation in a particular area. That innovation might be moving from another geography. So in aggregate, the level of innovation is the same. Then, all of these things like better property rights obviously work, but for some things they work better than others. So it's always a level of degree, and it always kind of helps to, maybe I shouldn't say always, but often helps to look at the specific context and try to understand what is unique about that context. And that's what we're doing here, but we're focusing particularly on an early policy related to the development of AI and automation technologies, not in the context of large language models as we're seeing today, about 20 years ago when it was really related to kind of industrial automation, and trying to understand what happens when a government tries to foster innovation in this domain. So in particular, we're looking at this Chinese 2006 policy by the Chinese government on indigenous innovation, meaning having innovations developed by Chinese companies and Chinese universities. And it was part of this, let's say, national innovation strategy, which was introduced for the first time in 2006 and expected to kind of lay out the path for innovation until 2020. And if you think about this period in time, this is really the starting point of China's innovation transformation. So a lot of the stuff that we're seeing today and that's in the news today goes back to this kind of point in time when really there was a launch of kind of a research and competitive trajectory. Before that, a lot of stuff was kind of often offshored in a way to reduce costs. But this really became a shift towards saying, let's do high value, high quality manufacturing. Let's become competitors in these other industries. Earlier, there was this emphasis on quantity rather than quality, and so this created this type of shift. And there was a stated goal of increasing the amount of patenting, increasing the amount of innovation that was happening. Now, this happens to the entire country and the entire geography, and so it's not really possible to disentangle what is the impact of this in aggregate. But we can focus on universities as a context that's really, really sensitive to this because universities receive. Firstly, university leadership is government appointed, so they have an incentive to meet government kind of strategy or government goals, government metrics. And my co-authors have some papers on this, to what extent like the political incentives of the people in charge lead them to respond to these government policies. And then all of the funding comes from universities. And so the university is more sensitive to this, and we're going to think about, can we observe how this impacted the development of innovation by universities? And we're going to look at firms as kind of a baseline that capture to what extent this is a popular industry, to what extent there's demand for this in the market, to what extent is this area simply developing, and we can compare against something. So it represents a fundamental shift in innovation, but particularly in the domain of industrial automation. So think about this as robotics, think about this as so we had this other paper where we looked at like patenting and AI up until about 2020, and most of this stuff is in the area of like machine vision, right? So having robots, having these tools that can identify when something is out of place, when a process isn't working, and instead of having a human there, having an automated process that can do that. And so this is, in this domain, this is a moment when all of a sudden there's an increase in innovation. And we're going to focus on this period from 2006 and 2012 because it coincides with the launching of this initiative, but it also coincides with one government administration. So it's kind of holding some things constant during that period. Okay, so we're using data from the Chinese equivalent of the USPTO. We're going to focus on patents granted in universities. We're using firms as a baseline for most of the stuff we're talking about. We identified patents related in this domain, which I can talk about, but basically training the classifier using using a language model that kind of pre-trained on these Chinese language embeddings, which helped simplify some of this process as compared to what we had to do in an earlier version of this paper. On average, we're able to kind of capture these patents relatively well. And so just to talk about what's happening. So in terms of development of this technology within China, there's a huge inflection around 2011, 2012, as there is in the rest of the world with growth of deep learning and all these things. But in 2006, there's an increase in the slope. And this is similar in the US. What's interesting here about China, and by the way, if you look at the US, most of this innovation is coming from companies. Very little is coming from universities. In China, with the exception of 3 large companies that I believe are Alibaba, ZTE, and somebody else, all of this is coming from universities. So in China, universities are a huge driver of innovation in this domain. And what you see is for firms, there's a constant kind of trajectory, whereas for universities, there seems to be an increase in this period, right? This increases from about 5%, 7% to about 16%. And so there's a considerable increase for universities as compared to firms. And we're going to try to understand, well, what is happening as a consequence? When they effectively double the rate of patenting, what's happening as a consequence? And so this is just a coefficient plot to show you that it's increasing more for universities. Okay, so same thing in graph, in table format, universities on average patenting more. I'm going to rush ahead just in the interest of time. And for universities, it becomes a more important part of their overall patenting strategy. So they're patenting more in absolute terms, but also a greater share of the patents they're generating are related to this technology. So universities are making a much bigger shift towards this than companies. Now, if you look at where this is happening, all of the big coastal cities where a lot of the tech hubs are the areas where there's most of this patenting. So this is not a surprise. What is surprising, if you look at the areas where this increased, it increased in these inland provinces, which are not the areas that are traditionally kind of the innovation hubs. So I'm going to give a US example, which is perhaps going to be insulting, but may get a few laughs. So if you think about places like Ohio, right, used to be innovation hubs, used to be areas that, like, in many ways were very important, but 50 years ago continue to be important politically, are less likely to drivers of innovation that many people would associate with, but these seem to be the places where there was the biggest jump. And they're places where that's at least, when my co-authors saw this, their interpretation was this seems to be aligned with this idea that, like, these places are the most sensitive to government funding. They're the areas where you would expect the biggest, or where it's interesting they get the biggest bump. And so these are the traditional tech hubs. This is the traditional manufacturing hubs. But here is where you see this huge bump in this kind of research in this AI domain. And so we find that these are the areas that had the least before, but experienced the biggest increase. Okay, so when we look at the universities that are patenting, the universities that are already active in this space patent more. So if you're already involved in this space, you already have expertise, you do even more, right? Consistent with what you might expect, you already have some built-in capacity, you start doing even more research. If you look at the impact in terms of the quality, what's happening is that the top universities, so they're already producing innovation, they're already producing patents in this domain. You can think of it as they were patenting their best ideas before, now they're patenting the other ones. We have an incentive to patent more, we patent more, but we're not necessarily patenting the best stuff. We're already doing that before. And so on average, the quality or the impact of the patents goes down. What you find is that the universities that weren't active in this space all of a sudden start producing research that's more impactful in this space. And so this goes down from a negative to a positive coefficient, but it's a pretty kind of linear decline. If we're interested in, you create research that nobody ever cites, the top universities or that is ever cited, the top universities start creating research that's never cited, whereas the bottom universities start creating more impactful innovation. So you see this effect, but it's not necessarily the same for top and bottom universities. Yes, there's more innovation. Top universities are producing less work. They're responding to these incentives, but it is pushing some universities at the bottom end to start producing more work. And what's also interesting is that in some sense, these universities at the bottom end, they are producing more research. It's not breakthrough, but they're just producing more research. But it does seem to be that there's breakthrough innovation happening within these universities in the middle. So they have some competence in this, they have some background. The top universities are producing it at what seems to be the same rate as before, but these kind of middle tier universities are starting to produce more. So part of what we're trying to understand in this project is basically you have this policy, how does it impact the development of innovation? There seems to be clear trade-offs. Yes, it increases patenting, but it also increases who's patenting what. Elite universities start to patent less, maybe jumpstarts research in other universities. And then really it's this quality difference that seems to be coming out. And then part of what we're going to try to do is trying to see if we can disentangle this with political incentives. As I mentioned, because these folks are politically appointed and there are these very clear measures in terms of like how sensitive they might be to performance, are there differences? And then one of the things we're also going to try to do is look at the shift in publication strategy. So patents are just kind of a course outcome of once they develop the innovation, but how much are they shifting their research trajectory as well, because they're sensitive to that. So with that, thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
I have kind of a broad question. Since you're thinking about innovation outcomes, how are you thinking about what the right statistic is? Right, it's like, is it the average? Is it the quantity? Is it the top decile? I mean, so it's a broader question, but what's your sense of that?
So I think of it as I think of it as like, I don't think of it that there's one right metric, and I guess that's why I'm trying to present it, because I feel like what it's kind of pointing at is like there's a combination of like on the aggregate outcomes or the average outcomes tend to be really kind of, yes, it has, you do a lot of stuff, it's mostly stuff that nobody cares about. And then like, it's a different question to think about these kind of, are you creating something? What is the probability that you created something that's like really valuable, right? And so the big universities were creating a lot of that stuff. The small universities were creating none of it. And so I think of it, it's not surprising that the bottom universities are creating more stuff because before they were creating none. But I think it's interesting to see that the top universities are creating more breakthroughs, if that makes sense. So I think they're kind of different questions.
Yeah.
I mean, did I answer it?
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about other like part of the question is, are there negative spillovers from creating trash, more trash?
Yeah.
Even if the top starts to go up, that's.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's part of also what when I breeze through it, like that's what I think is also interesting. Like, it's creating a lot more trash, I think, on average, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you look like how research has moved? That could be a justification of perhaps why some of these inland universities got a little bit more. It's just perhaps some researchers that did research on that particular area moved to different areas.
So that's part of what we were trying to. That's part of what we're trying to do. Interestingly, as unlike where I think there was a lot of like mobility in the U.S. across regions, there was much less mobility in China. I've been told within our data from this happening. But that's something that maybe we can tease apart with publications, that there seems to be much less mobility in this. Like what does seem to be happening is new kind of universities establishing new startups and new things here. So part of what we're trying to look at is not necessarily people moving from here to here, but people here moving from university to companies or university. There's some spillovers within the broader economy there. And that's part of what we're trying to, one of our next steps. Oh, yeah.
So two questions. One, given the kind of loosey-goosey way that the PRC usually thinks about intellectual property protections in other countries, is there a way to figure out whether or not there are significant overlaps between the patents that are being filed in China versus US or EU patents, so it's kind of piggybacking, or just expropriation of intellectual property? The other question is, because this is highly politicized, is there any evidence that we're changing the threshold which is necessary to constitute or to meet the intellectual property bar? Like, I don't know.
You mean to get patented?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think both are interesting. I think the first one we did in another paper that we never published, but you give me an idea how to bring it back, which is to show to what extent the U.S. and China are innovating in the same space in this domain, and to what extent it's just like an imitation of something or appropriation. Yeah. So I hadn't thought about it in the context of this because and I think it runs counter to that, but I think it's helpful to show it, is that like what we found was that a lot of this stuff was happening in the areas where the U.S. traditionally hasn't been innovating much. So it was actually some differentiation, but I think to show that is really important. And then the second thing, I think, rather than maybe the bar getting higher, I could imagine that the bar getting lower.
Yes.
Right? So this idea of them saying, like, we want to do more of this, and so now we're just patenting more crap. And I think that's also part of what we're trying to show, but I think maybe there's going to be some way of documenting just, like, they tend to make worse patents. They tend to be more similar to the other thing. There's less of it. And I think that's very much the story. Yeah.
So I think to produce this research, you also need talent, right? So I was wondering if you looked at the human capital, whether there'd be some shift over time, right, towards different expertise, if you look at academic profiles or something like this, I think that would be kind of help.
So that's part of what we're trying to do with publications. Part of what the metrics on political incentives that I was talking about mention is also they'll capture investment in other things related to human capital. So how much are the universities investing in developing expertise in a certain domain? So that's part of what we're going to try to capture with this, because that's another mechanism that they use. But I think the other thing that the publication strategies will give us is to what extent there are just people involved in this domain at this institution.
Also maybe like job postings, whatever that you have, right? Would be nice.
Yeah. I don't think that we'll get job postings in 2006.
A quick follow-up. I think political incentives are very, very important, because in one of your charts, I think one province pop up, Qinghai, which is number 10 or something, even before Tianjin, where I
This
got
one?
my, yeah, Qinghai.
Yeah.
Not many good university in that area.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's actually in front of Tianjin, where I got my undergrad. So also Tianjin is a coastal city, so there's a data area. Okay, so it shouldn't be black; should be coastal. Yeah. So yeah,
I will point it out to my colleagues.
Yes.
But
anyway,
this
that's
comes
not
with
my
a
point.
disclaimer that I don't know the judge, and I can.
Yeah. So that's not my point. But
I'll
Qinghai,
give them help.
particularly, I think our government invested a lot of money. I mean, in that area. Yeah. So I'm kind of surprised why there are so many patents from that area without many good universities. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was one of the other things that I don't have here, because this was a more kind of intuitive breakdown, but there are these internal classifications. And what we found was a lot of the not good universities, so a lot of the top elite research universities continued and maybe just published worse stuff. It was the other universities that actually increased, and these were the not good universities. And so that's kind of one of the ideas, that it provided something of a jumpstart to those institutions.
A quick reply to Sanya's question. I had a patent in China, so my patent quality is not that high. So generating more crap stuff is happening.
Yeah.
And we actually give people monetary incentives to submit patents. So we give a few, I think if the patent got approved, we pay the employee $1,000, but we also pay them to submit. So there's not only a political incentives, there's actually monetary incentives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, exactly, and that's part of the idea behind this. I think that's the broad, idea that we're trying to do, is this incentive to say, like, we want more of this stuff. Does it create then anything that is in fact valuable, right? Because on average, you're just going to get a lot of the worst ideas, but does that move the worst universities to actually start doing stuff that turns out to be useful? And I think that's at the heart of what we're trying to understand. Am I out of time? Okay. No? Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering, have you looked at the funding policy? Because in China, the top university usually directly funded by the central government, and not so good university, they have a lot of funding from the local government. And then for the inland provinces, you point out, actually in the past 2 decades, those provinces actually enjoy a significant economic growth. So it means that the local government is very rich. And then maybe it could be part of the policy, the local government put a lot of money to incentivize the submission of patent or publications.
So I think that is in line with this earlier thing that we had, but I think that's a really helpful way of actually framing them. And I think I think the buckets will align with a lot of what these buckets are
Yeah.
too, but I think
Yeah.
just showing that is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Thank-
sometimes like the local government give a lot of like a bonus and rewards to faculty to publish compared to the central government.
Indeed, and that's actually our whole like when we're talking about political incentives, that's the whole mechanism. That it's and my co-authors have this whole thing where it's like the person who's there's something about the person who controls the purse strings, and that person is at the state government or at the
Yes.
regional
Yeah.
government. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Yeah. Perfect. Is that it? Thank you. Thank you.